Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 168. This week the questions are taken from Guide 222 on the Conte de Cavour class battleships of the Italian Navy and the accompanying Wednesday video, which is the first night battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. So let's begin with questions. Road EO asks, did the Dominion of India have a separate navy like the other dominions like Australia or Canada? Not quite the same. There was an Indian naval service, which was variously called a marine or a navy, depending on exactly what time period you're looking at during the colonial period of India. But during the period that this channel covers, it was mostly relatively small. Like with every other colonial navy, it did expand during World War I and World War II, although nothing like the scale of expansion that the Australian or Canadian navies would undertake. And this is in large part down to the fact that for the 20th century at least, or the bulk of it, Canada and Australia were self-governing to a greater extent, and technically also fully independent countries one after a certain point. However, India was not. India remained under direct British rule pretty much up until the end of the Raj period after World War after World War II, I should say, sorry. And so without a completely separate government, completely separate budget and financing, there was no need, desire, or indeed structure with which to form a separate Royal Indian Navy per se. There was an Indian Naval Service, Indian Marine, eventually called Indian Navy, but it was effectively a sub-branch of the Royal Navy that happened to be based in India and had some Indian officers and a fair number of Indian sailors in it. Obviously, it would, to a large extent, form the core of what would become the Indian Navy in the latter half of the 20th century once India gained its independence, but during the period of the British Empire, it was never on a par with the Australian or Canadian navies. Extraordinary Voyage asks, you mentioned that aggressiveness is a preferred quality of destroyer captains. What are the preferred qualities of captains of other ship types? It's always a balance. Obviously, when it comes to warships, you want every captain to be somewhat aggressive, but there are degrees of that. So for destroyer captains, as mentioned, full-on aggressiveness, a willingness to just turn around and head straight at the enemy at almost every opportunity, is generally a favoured option. When it comes to something like, say, a cruiser, independent thinking is one of the most valued assets, especially once people realise that, that is actually an asset and not negative, 19th century Navy aside. Because cruisers are generally going to be operating far away from everybody else, far from home, far from other ships, during peacetime at least, and possibly also during wartime. And so the captain has charge of a fairly major asset, but he needs to be able to determine exactly how best to use that asset without really any reference to anybody else. And even when a cruiser captain is involved in a much larger action where he might be operating with other cruisers or as part of a fleet, he still needs to be relatively independently minded, because in, say, a World War I fleet, he's going to be most usually part of a fleet screen. So in that role, he has to find the enemy, he has to report where the enemy is, and he has to hopefully survive and also fend off the enemy fleet screen. None of that is something which the admiral of the fleet really wants to know about in detail, other than the position reports of the enemy fleet. And so the cruiser captain in question has to really get stuck into the idea of, I know what my role is, but I'm going to fulfill it the best way I see without further reference to anybody else, unless something really major is going down in that case. And when you see World War II cruiser engagements, for example, sometimes they are the capital ship that's present, and other times, if they're acting in support of other capital ships, at full-on battleships and battlecruisers, for instance, the cruiser captains, again, need to operate very much on their own initiative, scouting, reporting, supporting attacks, and when they're say, supporting an aircraft carrier. If the carrier is going to be attacked from a certain position, the cruiser captain needs to be able to position his ship in the best way to protect the carrier without asking the carrier captain, who's got more than enough things on his plate, what they want him to do. And if the carrier is badly damaged, a cruiser that almost immediately puts itself alongside to help with damage control efforts and firefighting is far superior to a cruiser captain who sits at his designated position several miles off and waits for orders, again from the somewhat harried aircraft carrier captain, who might well want him to come alongside but really doesn't have the time. Also, the signal flags might be on fire. In World War II, especially when it comes to something like a corvette or frigate captain, in those cases, what you want is a cross between a mathematical genius and someone who's incredibly sneaky. And strangely enough, that is pretty much also the profile for a submarine captain, even though the two are going to be hunting each other. Because when you're a submarine captain, obviously you've got to think about how fast can I go? Where's my torpedo going to go? What's the deflection of my torpedo going to be? Where do I need to be to launch that torpedo? What can the enemy do? Can they get in a position to block me or hunt me? Etc. And also, sneakiness is in a submarine's nature. In a frigate or corvette captain, it's almost the other way around. If they know where a submarine contact is, they've got to try and work out, okay, well, if I was in his mind, where would I be trying to go to evade me and to attack those ships over there? So what do I know about his performance characteristics, both in terms of the sub and the torpedo? So therefore, I think based on what I know of his tactics, he's probably going to go over there. I need to therefore position myself here. And when I go there and I attack him and he notices me, he's probably going to do this. And it's sort of you have to think about 20 steps ahead of your opponent in both the submarine hunter and submarine roles. It's a lot more close and personal than the vast majority of other combat in full-on warships in the First and Second World Wars. So it does require a rather different kind of person to someone that you might find in another role. And with battleship captains, there is where you usually want somebody who is a little bit conservative and a little bit more, shall we say, methodical in their thinking. That's because even in World War I, battleships are a huge investment. They are the capital ship, and in World War II for a good chunk of time they are. And this kind of also applies to aircraft carrier captains, albeit at a somewhat more distant remove. Effectively, you want someone who knows the value of the asset they've been entrusted with and isn't going to risk it unnecessarily in stupid situations. But you want someone who is very calculating of those risks and hazards and can sit there and work out, okay, I do this, these are the risks, this is what could happen, but these are the benefits, how does that fit in my mission profile, do I go for it or not? And obviously if it is an acceptable risk, how do I best carry that out? Now, if you had, let's take for example, HMS Warspite going into Narvik, a destroyer captain who's very aggressive might think that, let's take the ship in, lead from the front. That's probably a bad idea, actually. A cruiser captain is going to be thinking, right, I know how to operate my ship to the best of its ability. I will take my ship in and everyone else can kind of do what they like. Again, probably not the best of situations. Whereas someone who's very suited for battleship command will do pretty much what, at that point, Captain Crutchley did, which is, along with his admiral, turn around and go, right, I don't want to overly risk this asset, so I will need a destroyer screen to go ahead of me. However, they need backup and firepower, therefore I need to follow in relatively close behind them and offer direct support with my heavy guns. And my heavy guns need to be fairly accurate, and everyone needs to be on their toes. So it's kind of that slightly more calculated, reserved aggression as opposed to the destroyer captain. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that one captain can only serve on one particular kind of ship. There are lots of captains who work, well, pretty much all of them, who end up in various commands, who will have commanded multiple different ships and multiple different classes, and the very best captains can adapt their command style and personality to the ship that they're in. But Some captains have a very particular streak and skill set towards a particular role, and whilst they might do perfectly well in command of other vessels, they will excel in specific vessel types. And sometimes you see a little bit of crossover between the two different or multiple different roles, depending on what experience that captain has. For example, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton of Rodney, a 35,000-ton battleship doesn't snake its way across the battle environment chasing salvos like some kind of destroyer that's trying to press a torpedo attack home against inevitable odds. But that's how Dalrymple Hamilton handles Rodney in the face of Bismarck salvos, and is probably a good chunk of the reason why Rodney isn't directly hit by Bismarck salvos before its guns are knocked out. So there are skills that can cross over between them, but there are certain specific characteristics that are looked for the best postings for the respective ship types. Scott Giles asks, if a Kongo class could get shot up as badly as they did at the naval battle of Guadalcanal by a mere heavy cruiser, is it fair to call it a battleship? Well, to be entirely fair to them, for most battleships, if you get down to the kind of ranges that the first naval battle Guadalcanal was fought at, most heavy cruisers can get through most battleships' protection at stupidly close range. Now, granted, you are talking about single-digit 1,000 yards of range, but, that's the kind of action that was being fought in some cases at the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. However, with that said, the Kongo's armour could be penetrated at what would be counted as short range in World War II naval engagements, as opposed to purely at murderously point-blank ranges. Now, the Kongo's being classified as battleships is something I fundamentally disagree with, and you'll have noticed during pretty much all my videos I always refer to them as battlecruisers, even in World War II. And I think I have fairly good reason for this. Whilst, yes, some sources will call them battleships, and the Japanese, for that matter, in some cases also call them battleships during the Second World War, that was more to do with their role rather than their actual capability. So when they were modernised, the Japanese then put them into mostly things like carrier escort roles, and obviously then pressed them into action in Guadalcanal. But they were being used in a way that was commensurate with the use of other capital ships, except for the fact that they were faster, therefore they could be used for certain roles that something like a Fuso, an Issei, or a Nagato couldn't, simply because they couldn't keep up. But when you look at the modernisation, they went into that modernisation as battle cruisers. They were faster than the average battleship. They had similar caliber guns to contemporary battleships of the time of their building, but fewer of them, and they had thinner armour. Fairly thin armour. I mean, it wasn't awful armour for the time period of World War I, but it still wasn't great. Even the Renown class had more armour than the Kongos. Now, if you were, in my opinion, going to legitimately call them battleships in World War II, then what that modernisation should have done is uprate their armour. So it might have resulted in a sacrifice in speed. It might have resulted in their speed staying the same in the high 20s of knots, depending on how much more modern machinery you stick in there. But if you could push them up to, say, 12 inches of belt armour, then, 28 knots-ish, 12 inches of belt armour, 8 14-inch guns, you could legitimately call that battleship, I think. It wouldn't be the world's most heavily armed battleship, but it would be a battleship. But they didn't do that. They kept the armour protection broadly the same. They did a few upgrades and changes here and there, but fundamentally the ability of the ship to resist battleship caliber gunfire was practically unchanged. They ramped the speed up, which, is generally a characteristic of battlecruisers, and main armament stayed the same. It was still the same 8 14-inch guns, again with some modifications to the turrets and so forth. So fundamentally what they'd taken the main thing that had been improved, I mean, lots of minor things had been improved, but the main sort of headline change was they'd made them even faster, which just made them better battle cruisers. So I don't think there's any reasonable justification to call them battleships. They didn't have the protection to be called battleships. They had the speed characteristics of a battle cruiser by every conceivable metric, at least until some of the very last fast battleships like the Iowas came in, and that's a whole other discussion there. And they still had, slightly less firepower, even compared to King George V. King George V had 10 14-inch guns. The Congos had 8. So they're battle cruisers. They act like battle cruisers. They fight like battle cruisers. They are built like battle cruisers. I can't see any justification for calling them a battleship. Yes, they might have been put on purpose in certain positions that battleships would normally fulfill, but, if the Soviets had invaded West Germany at the latter stages of the Cold War and somebody had taken a pickup truck with a missile launcher or a 75mm gun on a sort of a standard field emplacement and run out onto the front lines and started taking pot shots at Soviet tanks, that doesn't make that vehicle a tank. It just means it's trying to do the role of a tank badly and will probably suffer and die horribly for it, which coincidentally is exactly what happened to most of the Congos. Keeper asks, I have to say I'm a bit confused about the whole Guadalcanal campaign. It seemed to unfold exactly how the Japanese Navy wanted, how they were trained, what their ships were designed to do, and yet they seemed to suffer badly in almost every encounter. How could this be? Was there something fundamentally wrong? Well, the Japanese ships didn't suffer badly in every single encounter. The Battle of Tassafaronga, First Battle of Savo Island, a couple of others, they actually came out pretty well from it. But the reason that the Japanese Navy effectively got ground down to a certain extent in the Guadalcanal campaign and why they eventually had to leave was a combination of, several factors. Some of the smaller factors, the complete lack of any meaningful cooperation between the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army. It directly contributed to a number of ship losses, but it overall contributed to the inability to either suppress or take Henderson Field, and air power was very definitely a key element of the Guadalcanal campaign. And whilst the Japanese Navy did appreciate the overall power of aircraft, that's why they'd formed the WWII, amongst other things, the simple fact that the US had this forward airbase able to operate in support of their troops and in support of their shipping and against Japanese shipping, and the Japanese didn't have that, unless you want to do a really, really long-range mission from Rabaul, was a significant issue and problem for them. Another factor was how they treated their admirals. Now, to be fair, a fair number of the American admirals who were fed into the Guadalcanal campaign weren't exactly much to write home about. Some of them, on the other hand, were very good. But one of the key differences is that when you did get an admiral who either learned from his mistakes or was just very good to start with, like Admiral Lee, then unless something really unfortunate happened to them, like what happened to Admiral Scott, the US Navy tended to keep them around for future use. Whereas you can look through the whole list of Japanese admirals who took part in the Guadalcanal campaign. Some of them were very good, some of them were awful, some of them were just mediocre. But a lot of the ones that had enjoyed the better successes, such as Mikawa at the First Savo Island and Tanaka at Tassafaronga, they, for reasons that are somewhat opaque to comprehend, were effectively punished for not winning hard enough and either given subordinate roles or sent off to roles that didn't even involve frontline combat, either during the campaign or thereafter, whereas other admirals who actually really badly stuffed up some of the engagements just kept on going and were kept on the front lines and, shockingly enough, continued to mess up other engagements later on. That is a fundamental issue with the Japanese Navy in World War II. Unfortunately, they don't seem to reward success unless it is total and absolute, and as if you're high enough rank, as long as your failure isn't complete and utter to the point that you go down with your ship, you seem to just keep in your job. And another significant factor, probably the most significant factor, is just simply the size and scale of the opponent that they were up against. The Japanese inflicted massively disproportionate losses on the US Navy. And, it can be characterized by at one point in the latter stage of the campaign, the US Navy was down to only about a dozen cruisers in the entirety of the Pacific theatre. Now that sounds quite bad. Indeed, it was quite bad. But it was also temporary. The US could call in other cruisers, it was building new cruisers, and it was refitting other cruisers that had already been damaged. The Japanese weren't. The best they could do was repair some badly damaged ships, but they simply weren't building much new cruiser tonnage. And they didn't have as much as the US Navy did to start with. So whilst the Americans were looking at the Pacific Theatre and for a few weeks going, this is bad, we've only got a dozen or so cruisers for the operational theatre, for a lot of the war, the Japanese would be hard-pressed to find a dozen operational serious cruisers, period, after the initial losses had come into play. And fundamentally, you can almost look at the Guadalcanal campaign from the Japanese perspective as a literal case of we've won the battles, but not the war. Overall, you can argue the Japanese won more than they lost in terms of direct engagements during the Guadalcanal campaign on a tactical level. But on a strategic level, on the scale of the entire war, they were losing simply because the war wasn't being fought in the way that they thought it was going to be fought. The US simply wasn't engaging in the big decisive battle that they wanted. Even Midway didn't represent the entire carrier strength and none of the battleship strength of the US Navy in the Pacific. And when you look at it through that lens, the Japanese forces had been set up to, yes, win a series of night actions like you saw at Guadalcanal. But then the idea was to use the temporary advantage they'd got to sink the enemy battle fleet. But the Americans weren't putting the battle fleet out there for them to attack. If you look at on paper by the end of 1942, theoretically the Japanese have more carrier deck space, and they still have some fairly decent carrier pilots left at this point. So the Japanese carrier arm, broadly speaking, is in a better state than the US Navy's carrier arm by the end of 42. Battleship-wise, again, the Japanese are actually in probably a fundamentally slightly better state. They've got pretty much their entire battle line minus a few Kongos. The US Navy is still only just about commissioning its first few fast battleships, and thanks to Pearl Harbor is obviously still short quite a few sort of more regular battleships of the kind that you'd want to throw against the Fusos and the Iseis and so forth. And as we said, they're running low on cruisers. So if the US Navy had at that point decided to throw everything at the Japanese, shipwise, in a grand battle, that's probably the closest that the Japanese would ever have to being on a footing where they could possibly win. But the Americans just said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep some ships at home. We're going to build up our forces. We're going to engage you in theatres where we think we can leverage our advantages locally for superiority. And then once we've built up a navy that can crush you much, much easier, we're going to come and start steamrolling you. And the Americans just weren't playing by the Japanese book. And so you had the Japanese Navy that had achieved not everything, but a good chunk of what it was supposed to, and then found itself with an enemy who just wouldn't take the next step. Wienve asks, as far as I can tell, the Soviet Navy gained ships that were put to active service from at least the Japanese, German, Italian, Romanian and Finnish navies after the Second World War. Were any of these ships of any practical use? A number of ships that the Russians received as prizes-reparations did indeed stick around in Soviet service for quite a long time. Now, obviously, there are always going to be issues with such a weird and wonderful fleet in terms of spare parts, access to maintenance and qualified maintenance technicians, keeping everything running, and some ships just fundamentally not being designed for the environments that the Russians were now putting them into service in. However, that aside, they did serve two major functions that were fairly practical. The first of which was that it meant the Russian Navy had access to a wide range of relatively modern ship technologies. Remember, in the 1930s, after the, should we say, hiatus caused by the communist takeover, the Russian warship design was really trying to find its feet again. And a lot of ships and technology were being bought in from other places, like Tashkent being pretty much designed and built in Italy, various guns and rangefinders, and even some radars being ordered, and in some cases even delivered from Germany, and so on and so forth. So this was kind of, well, not free, because they'd paid for it with the casualties that they sustained during World War II, but at point of, if you like, sale, free access to all sorts of, as I say, relatively modern technologies from a wide range of different sources. So obviously with Japanese ships, they got access to Japanese torpedo technology, German ships fire control technology, Italian ships also fire control technology, engine technology, all sorts of things. And that allowed them to sort through their own designs as well as the designs and equipment of these various foreign vessels and collate a somewhat better idea of how they wanted to go forward when it came to designing the next generation, i.e. the first Cold War generation of warships. And apart from that, as I said, they did keep a number of them around for patrol boat uses and other such things for quite a while, as you know, they were relatively solid vessels for low priority theatres of operation, since obviously by the mid-50s anything that was relatively unupgraded from the Second World War would be falling behind a little. Tues GCDC Fagik K, apparently, asks, how exactly do you turn a ship like Leonardo da Vinci when it's upside down in the Drydock? I can't imagine them having massive anti-gravity wells during World War I, so it seems a bit of a Herculean task to me. Well, yeah, you might well ask. You've got this upside-down battleship in a Drydock. Turning it the right way up is going to be a little bit of a problem, isn't it? And, well, yes, it is. However, the Italians decided they were going to be very inventive indeed. So, you know, the keel of a ship is designed to support the weight of the ship. The decks of a ship, not really designed to support the hull of the ship when it's upside down. So it couldn't stay in this position for long. So the Italians got a very inventive person in charge of the entire operation by the name of Major Gianelli, and he worked out that if you patched everything, you know, sealed all the holes, got all the water out, covered the big holes where the turrets had been, where the funnels had been, etc., basically made the ship a watertight hulk, then if you sailed it out into the middle of the bay and dredged a portion of the bay, so you had a nice deep basin underneath it, then before sailing out upside down, you put a bunch of weights on one side, and then you did controlled flooding on that side as well. You should make the ship kind of reverse capsize. And then, in theory, because obviously the ship had been designed to float the right way up, the momentum of this reverse capsizing would carry it around until such point as it passed back through its metacentric height and central buoyancy and popped back up the right way. And then you could turn it back into dock and salvage it. So he gave it a good go, and what do you know, it succeeded. It almost, for a moment, looked like it might just do a barrel roll and end up upside down again, but it did in fact succeed. They took it out, they rolled it back up the right way, and then they towed it back up into dock, which you can see in the pictures here. And so when the decision came eventually to scrap the ship, it was in fact sitting in dock upright. Greatly helped, obviously, in terms of its stability by the fact that all the heavy weight above the main deck had gone which was in large part responsible for the reason that it was able to roll over and then stay upright again. Matt Bowden asks, some, although not all books, describe the rebuild of the Conte de Cavours and Andrea Dorias as a complete waste of time and money. I think this is based entirely on hindsight and is somewhat unfair. What is your opinion? I broadly agree with you. I think it's very easy to look back and say, well, the Italians lost, therefore all this time and money they spent modernising their 4 older battleships was wasted. Well, technically, at that point, you could argue that the entire Kriegsmarine, the entire Regimarine, and the entire Imperial Japanese Navy were all wastes of time and money because they lost. And, within certain parameters, you could even make a credible argument for that. But I think more broadly, looking at both the thinking at the time of the rebuilds themselves and then during the war as well, I don't think you can characterise the rebuilds as a waste of time and money. In fact, they were one of, if not the most successful rebuilds in terms of capability increase of any of the rebuilds that occurred in any of the nations during the interwar period. And I think it's important to look at what the capability of the ships was before and after relative to other ships. So if you look at ships built around the same time as the Dorias and the Cavours originally, there were still a few around in World War II. Arkansas, the Britannias, the Revenges, well, kind of the Queen Elizabeth and the Revenges, they're a little bit later, but even so. And then you look at, okay, so what were their relative capabilities? Well, the Britannias, really there wasn't anything left to write home about on them, to be perfectly honest. And when you compare their capabilities with the Cavours had more modern fire control, they'd modernised their guns, they could move much, much faster. The Cavours had basically been turned in, and the Dorias had been turned into basically sort of smallish, fast battleships. They could, I think, quite easily beat a Britannia in a fight, and they would be able to choose when and where that fight occurred. Same thing with something like Arkansas. The sheer increase in speed and the overall modernisation of its fire control equipment would give a Cavour or a Doria a significant advantage over something like Arkansas. Then you get onto the much relatively speaking, later Queen Elizabeth and Revenge classes. Now, obviously, some of the Queen Elizabeths had been modernised, but when you look at the relatively less modernised Malaya and Barham, and obviously the Revenges, again, the Dorias are much faster, and so the Cavours, obviously. Now, granted, their firepower isn't quite the same. They've got more guns, but it's significantly less firepower than a 15-inch gun, so okay, there's an advantage there for the British ships. Likewise with the armour scheme, there's an advantage there. But when you say look at something like the Battle of Calabria, yeah, okay, Warspite in its sort of mostly modernised state did beat Giulio Cesare, but Cesare was a credible threat to Warspite, and even with its funnel knocked out, or partially knocked out, and thus lowering its overall speed, it was able to break off the engagement when it looked like the slower ships that were following on from Warspite might catch up. In its unupgraded state, it would not have been able to escape that engagement, and probably wouldn't have tried to force that engagement in the first place because its capabilities would have been considerably less. So what you got for the Italians was 4 fairly credible combatants for the Mediterranean theatre that meant that, yes, okay, you could put something like Warspite or Queen Elizabeth or Valiant in there, which could easily match them one-on-one, maybe even something like Renown you could make an argument for. But it forced the Royal Navy to make those deployments. If they hadn't done that modernisation, then the Royal Navy could have stuck the Revenge class in there, and until the Littorios started coming into action, pretty much have called it a day. Instead, it drew in significant enemy forces, tied them up, and they were considered credible threats to the rest of the Allied Navy forces for the rest of the war. I mean, a modernised Doria or Cavour would quite happily eat through anything that wasn't a battleship if they caught it, and their speed meant they probably could catch most things. if they were caught a bit flat-footed. Obviously, destroyers and cruisers could run away, but the speed difference was relatively low, so if one of these older ships rebuilt got the jump on them, they would have enough time to engage where they could potentially get crippling hits in before the speed advantage let the smaller ship run away. Captain Seafort asks, capital ships in the first couple of decades of the 20th century seem to have a rather unfortunate habit of spontaneously exploding. Off the top of my head, in addition to Leonardo da Vinci, I can think of Bulwark, Vanguard, Liberté, Iena, and Kawaichi. Most descriptions of these attribute them to unstable or decomposing propellant, but what exactly was wrong with the stuff? Did the decomposition process lead to them being more sensitive to heat or shock until an external event set them off? Did they decompose exothermically, leading to spontaneous ignition, or something else? The problem is actually even more widespread than you might otherwise think. There were a lot of other ships at the time, not just battleships, but other small vessels, which suffered spontaneous explosions, which didn't result in the complete and catastrophic loss of the ship, but were still quite bad, which were all also due to problems with ammunition and the propellants. Now, the thing is, it's not entirely possible to attribute it all to one specific cause, because all of these navies used different compositions in their explosives, and so the problem in one navy wouldn't necessarily be the same in another navy. The French, for example, suffered quite a number of explosions, I say not all of them causing total losses, which were due to the fact that the nitrocellulose-based propellants that they were using did, over time, decay exothermically, and thus get up to a temperature whereby they could self-ignite, and then suddenly, magazines go up in massive explosions, which is not good at all. And when it came to British formulations of cordite at the time, as I mentioned in the Jutland video, these did have an unfortunate habit of, as they decayed, rather than decaying exothermically, they would begin to sweat crystals, well, initially a gel, but would then solidify into crystals of what was effectively, near enough makes no difference, pure nitroglycerin, as well as other interesting products. And those are obviously somewhat shock sensitive, but also would then fall off as a dust, and a very explosive and flammable dust. So if there was a spark somewhere where this dust was, that could cause a massive flare-up of all the other dust and then lead back to an explosion. This was one of the things that, for example, the chief gunner aboard HMS Lion demonstrated in the months leading up to Jutland. And a lot of it across the board can probably be attributed to two factors, and both of them are to do with the replacement of the old black powder propellants, which everybody knew about because, black powder had been a thing aboard warships for hundreds of years, with all these various new propellants. So the two factors were, one, that because all these new propellants, although they were more powerful, were seen to be safer, they appeared to be safer, and so the incredibly strict procedures in magazine storage that had been in place when ships were using black powder had in many cases tended to be relaxed somewhat, because hey, it's not quite as dangerous as black powder, therefore it should be fine. And that was technically true when the charges were fresh, but due to various issues with the way they decomposed over time, it became less and less true as time went on. So these slightly lax safety procedures would then potentially lead to an explosion. And the other thing was just simply the fact that these propellants were new. Because it wasn't black powder, because it wasn't something that everyone had hundreds of years of operational experience with, no one actually knew in the very early 1910s, when you've got things like poudre à bille or cordite or whatever, what exactly happens when these things are left on a shelf for years at a time, because there simply hadn't been years or decades since the things had been invented and then left on a shelf to see what would happen. And so some of this stuff was, relatively speaking, unexpected. Now, granted, you could argue that perhaps some of it could have been anticipated, but then again, if you're developing a brand new explosive and it seems stable, and you test it again 6 months later and it's still stable, you test it a year later and it's still stable, you test it 2-3 years later and it's still stable, are you necessarily going to leave a bunch of your early formulation explosives sitting on a shelf for another decade just to see if maybe it will eventually become unstable when all your other data seems to suggest it isn't going to do so. In one or two cases of explosions aboard ships in this period, you can't necessarily rule out accident or arson, but for the most part it appears to have been the largely unanticipated and unintended consequences of these newer formulations of explosive decaying into more unstable and more sensitive or possibly even self-igniting forms, and then eventually the inevitable happening, something going wrong somewhere which causes a fire or a spark, and then that's pretty much all she wrote, because there's several hundred tons of potentially very, very unstable explosive waiting for the excuse to, distribute itself liberally across the dockyard. Glenn Ricafrente asks, the theory was that large 6-inch gun cruisers could match large 8-inch gun cruisers, assuming they're all roughly treaty bound, through higher rates of fire and more numerous shells per salvo. Do you think this theory held up in World War II, or was it never proven one way or another? I'd say the jury is still out on that one. The problem is that the cruiser clashes that did occur during World War II, effectively we never got the chance to see the direct correlation in action. Now, there were a few cruiser clashes, granted, in World War II, where it's pure cruiser on cruiser as opposed to a clash that a cruiser was involved in. But most of those involved heavy cruisers. Berwick versus Prince Eugen, Salt Lake City versus several Japanese cruisers, and so on and so forth. Or you have Salvo Island, where, again, it's heavy cruisers, and B, it's an ambush, so not quite fair. Although you might, I suppose, be able to argue that maybe a 6-inch cruiser might be able to make itself ready just a fraction faster than an 8-inch cruiser, but I doubt that would have helped too much. Or where cruisers were fighting, there were bigger things to worry about. A lot of the battles in the Mediterranean, for example, would see British cruisers, almost entirely 5.25 and 6-inch, face off against Italian cruisers, most of which were 8-inch, which you think would be the perfect environment, except that a lot of the time there were things like Italian battleships in the area, and so on and so forth. And where occasionally you did have cruisers clashing with no other external interference, like, say, the Battle of the River Plate or the Battle of the Barents Sea, you have other complications, like the fact that the Leanders are not the 10,000-ton treaty-like cruisers that the Royal Navy possesses. That would be the towns. Plus, the Deutschlands are not exactly a treaty-heavy cruiser, and at the Battle of the Barents Sea, neither is a Hipper-class a treaty cruiser. So most of the confrontations where you could gauge a 6-inch versus an 8-inch cruiser, it's not a 8-inch treaty cruiser. About the closest you could probably find would be maybe some of the earlier Japanese heavy cruisers, if they ever got to face off against a Brooklyn or a Cleveland or something like that in a 1-on-1 or 2v2 action, but we never got to see that either. So unfortunately, I think in terms of being able to point to an engagement or a series of engagements and say this is definitively one way or the other proof of whether or not the theory was good, I'd say we don't have that. Jury's still out. The only thing I think that was shown was that when you have an over-tonnage cruiser, like a Hipper or something, or a Deutschland, then 6-inch shell fire could get somewhat problematic, either because the ship's just big enough it can take some of a pounding and then return fire, or where, in the case of something like Graf Spee, because it's over treaty limits, it has the protection to be able to shrug off some of the 6-inch fire long enough for it to send heavy fire back. So I would say that absent of definitive proof between vaguely compliant treaty cruisers, the main lesson is that the 6-inch gun would only ever beat an 8-inch ship, either if you're talking about an autoloader 6-inch ship like a Worcester, or if both ships are otherwise compliant or near enough with the treaty. But the general trend of can a 6-inch ship beat an 8-inch ship where displacement is kind of a bit more free reign? Probably not. Ryan Frederick asks, what are some good authoritative sources for ship paint schemes and appearances through time? This is actually a pretty difficult one, to be perfectly honest, because it varies quite considerably between navies and at different time periods. And I know that may sound familiar to some of you who listen to the Drydock quite often, but it is true. So for, say, the US Navy in World War II, there's actually a website, I can't remember exactly what it's called off the top of my head, but there is a website where someone's actually tabulated all the various US camouflage schemes and paint schemes during the war, and when sort of approximately the years that they were introduced, the years that they were in some cases obsoleted, and for a lot of US ships, they actually have a table that shows when the ship, at least when you're talking about the bigger ones, sort of down to destroyer level, when that ship received or was ordered to paint itself in a particular paint scheme and when it switched over to another. So for most of the larger US ships during the Second World War, I'd say that's a pretty good database. But I'm not aware of one that is as comprehensive for British warships, for instance. And the further back you go through World War I and then into the 19th century, the less and less reliable the data gets. To be perfectly honest, if you want to portray a ship in a particular period, I would suggest that at least for the 20th century and the latter half of the 19th, you try and find a photo of the ship in that year or close enough to it, or ask someone if they have a photo that they might be able to show you of that vessel. Now, of course, 99% of those photos are going to be in black and white, but it should give you some idea of at least where different colours are, and then you can look for copies of Admiralty documents or guides, etc., that cover the paint scheme for that navy, and see which one most closely matches. So if a particular ship, let's say a particular navy, if you know that in a given year they had two sets of colour schemes, one where the hull was one shade of grey and the superstructure was another, and the second one where the entire hull and superstructure was the same shade of grey, then you find a photo and you look at the ship, and even though it's black and white, the ship superstructure and the hull look to be different colours or different shades of grey. Then you know, okay, well, it's using the differential colour scheme, so I paint it that way. And if it looks like it's the same, well, then it's the monoform colour scheme. So that would be my advice. For some, but even niche parts of certain navies, like the Perkins guides, for instance, excellent for British battleship coloration, at least up until the point where they run out. But once you get back past probably the 1820s or so, you're going to have a lot of problems, because things like, say, the Nelson checker, the yellow and black banding, we know when that was brought in. But then once you get much further back than that, into the late 1700s for the Royal Navy, there's a lot of independent coloration, and you're going to have to look at individual ships, or perhaps some of the better reference works on that tabulate and chart particular warships, because some of those will say this particular ship had this colour, this colour, and this colour. Whereas if you're looking at, say, the French or the Spanish, good luck, is all I'll say, because the short answer is, prior to about 1820, we genuinely don't know for 95% of the ships, 95% of the time, exactly what colour they were, unless somebody happened to have tabulated it, usually when the ship was captured. Jacob Garrett Lieb asks, what are some of the best or funniest instances of naval bureaucratic warfare amongst European powers? For example, the US Navy creatively interpreting upgrade to mean commissioning a completely new ship instead of the requested ironclad in the steam and steel era, or in more modern times, the US Air Force upgrading the AIM-9 Sidewinder series until the only part left from the original is the mounting bolts. Well, at one point, the Admiralty was planning on telling everyone that some of the last pre-war Royal Navy destroyers, the J through N class, they're actually planning on telling people that they were equipped, and with this wonderful, the wonderful Royal Navy term, for, but not with, 6 4.7-inch guns. They designed the ship to have 6 in 3 twin mounts, and because they were worried about how this might play with the, at that point, rapidly collapsing treaty system, they actually proposed at one point to launch the ships almost battle class style with four guns in two twin mounts forward and leave the aft mount empty, no guns, no shield or anything, and say to everyone, no, honestly, they're 4-gun destroyers, and then, quietly sneak the last pair of guns aboard when the need arose, and to have them obviously all in stock waiting. Then, of course, you have Fisher with the higher admiralty, so the civilian side of things, and the Treasury saying you can't build any capital ships in the middle part of World War I. And he said, that's fine, I will build large light cruisers, because I'm allowed to build light cruisers, and hence Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. And then, of course, in the run-up to World War II, you have the German insistence, absolute 100% insistence, that we are building torpedo boats. And everyone's looking at it going, the only way those things are torpedo boats are in comparison with your destroyers, which are, to be honest, rivaling the French for sillily sized. And they're going, no, they're torpedo boats, they're not destroyers. It's like, okay, well, let's take some of your mid-1930s torpedo boats and stack them up against some early to mid-1930s destroyers. They are suspiciously similar, but they would still be called torpedo boats going forward. And depending on certain reports, I've only read this in one source. It's a relatively good source, so I'm tempted to believe it, but then again, I've read other good sources covering the time period that don't mention it, so I'm not entirely sure. But some of you will have noticed in, say, the video on the Henri IV, that there were some very odd calibers floating around the French Navy in the late 19th century. Calibers that have no round number in either metric or imperial. And it turns out that these calibers are quite literally the caliber of various cannon from the age of sail, like 18, 24, 36 pounder, because the French used 36 pounders, although French pounds, not British imperial pounds, but regardless. Anyway, they're literally the exact caliber bore size of cannons of those shot weights. And of course, since the cannons of that period were bored for the shot of a certain weight rather than to a particular diameter, you get these weird and wonderful measurements. Now, this one particular source, I say, they claim that the reason for the continuation of those absolutely bizarre calibers was somebody in French bureaucracy deciding that it was far too complicated to try and persuade everybody to introduce a new type of gun. And so they just insisted on the same caliber being repeated over and over, because then technically you could claim you weren't introducing a new type of gun. It was the same as the old gun. Look, the caliber's the same and everything. Yes, it might use new materials. Yes, it might have a longer barrel. Yes, it might be made out of steel instead of iron. Yes, it might use shell and armor-piercing shell instead of, solid round shot. But that's just a variant of an existing gun, so you don't have to make me go through extra paperwork and approvals. Now, as I say, if that's true, I would like to meet that Frenchman and shake his hand, because that is a devious bit of bureaucracy. Adam Schindler asks, is there a realistic alternate history where the French win or draw at the Battle of the Nile? Was the floating fortress strategy so flawed that it couldn't have worked, or was Nelson's victory less assured than has been assumed since? In theory, it's possible to construct a scenario where the French win, but it is very difficult, because you've got to remember, for the Battle of the Nile, the doubling of the French fleet, as in a bunch of British ships cutting inside them, wasn't actually in the original plan. Nelson actually assumed that the French would have been smart enough to completely block off the deeper portions of the bay, and his original plan was for his fleet, which had one more ship but slightly weaker ships, because the British fleet was all 74s except for one 50 gunner, whereas the French fleet, as I say, although they were one less, they had 3 80 gunners and, of course, L'Orient, first rate, which somewhat redressed the balance. But anyway, so Nelson's plan was to drift down the French line and to actually anchor his ships 2/3 of the way down. So he would engage the van and mid part of the French fleet with his entire fleet, which would allow him to have local superiority, because the wind blowing him down on them would mean that the French rearguard ships couldn't come up to help the other vessels, and the only way they'd be able to move at all would be if they tried to get their own boats to tow them, at which point British bow chaser guns could probably deal with that. So if the plan had gone as planned, then you would have had an almost 2 versus 1 effect on the French vanguard and centre. As it was, they pretty much had the same thing, just with ships coming down either side. And of course, with the British gunners able to fire somewhat faster than the French ones, due to the effects, amongst other things, of the French Revolution on the French fleet, given the circumstances, given the sides in question, it's very difficult to come up with a scenario where the French actually win on their own strengths, as opposed to something going catastrophically wrong, like a bunch of the British ships trying to cut in and then all going aground, or something like that. In the abstract, when you just look at the tactical situation, then yes, if you had all crews being equal, it's possible that the defensive side could have won, because, as I say, they have a technical preponderance of firepower as long as both sides are willing to meet one-on-one, which of course Nelson wasn't going to do. But if they closed off that head of the deeper water, so that all the enemy ships had to come down one side and put their ships in a slightly tighter formation and rig them with springs the way that Nelson had ordered his ships to, so that they could orient themselves to bring concentrated fire, and then had their line in a concave as opposed to a convex curve, then in theory, yes, that could have worked, because then as the enemy fleet attacks, the concave curve of the fleet would be able to warp their ships around on their anchor springs a little bit, and effectively pour 5 or 6 ships worth of fire into the first enemy ship that comes in range, which is probably going to cripple it, or at least knock it out of line, and they can basically repeat that exercise as the rest of the enemy ships come down the line. Vokir asks, I recently reread the story of how the Pepsi company inherited a Soviet fleet for scrapping in lieu of hard currency in the 80s. The joke is that they were briefly, at least on paper, a contending naval power. It got me thinking, during the period this channel covers, were there any major examples of private or commercially owned warships? Obviously, during the Age of Sail, major corporations such as the East India Company operated sizable fleets of pseudo-warships, but when did this practice die off? So there were 2 main factors in the dying away of privately owned or corporately owned warships in the 19th century. Believe it or not, regulation had relatively little to do with it. Regulations were brought in, but regulations were also left open to allow for the arming of merchant ships during the time of war, and also for ships to be strengthened to take guns in peacetime, even if they didn't necessarily carry them, and so on and so forth. The 2 main driving factors were, 1, the need, because private and commercially owned warships are expensive to run and don't make as much profit as dedicated cargo ships. Now, back in the day, when you might be set upon by various kinds of marauding pirates, or there's a war on and there might be a lot of enemy raiders, and those raiders might come in a quite large number of things like sloops and barks and even small frigates that perhaps your large ship, if it carried a reasonable armament, might be able to see off. Those days had passed. There wasn't a major war on, and most of the pirate groups, not all, but most, had been exterminated. And if you did come across a raiding vessel, like a cruiser or something, technology had advanced so far that without any kind of significant fire control systems and a fairly heavy armament, which again would make your vessel uneconomic to run, then you'd lose. So there was little point. The seas were peaceful and calm for the most part, and therefore people just didn't because it cost them money. The other aspect I hinted to in there was the advance of technology. So back in the day, if you had a East Indiaman of, say, 1,500 tons, it might be able to see off a fair number of enemy ships. Obviously, if a proper sort of fifth-rate frigate or above came after you, you were pretty stuffed. But there was a measure of security there, and also, you had a wooden ship, you put some cannon on it. That wasn't exactly particularly difficult. Once you got into the age of steam and steel, however, and you started to get armour and guns necessary to pierce armour, all of a sudden all of this additional deadweight and all of this additional cost that you needed to run a warship as opposed to a merchant vessel suddenly started to increase dramatically. And with that dramatic increase in costs, again, people just didn't really feel much of the need. So in kind of the mid-19th century, the idea of privately armed warships began to die. There was still a few around in that time period, like the Nemesis of the East India Company, but then also the breaking up and or nationalisation of some of those larger companies, like the East India Company, started to diminish the numbers of organisations that could even afford it in the first place, even if they did want to go through the cost and expense. And finally, Togfather asks, something that's come up a few times in videos in recent months has been the German use of sliding breech blocks in their naval guns, and the effects this had on their turret designs. Why did the Germans persist in using sliding breech blocks when every other significant navy seems to have adopted the well-in breech block for guns that didn't use single-piece ammunition? Is there some advantage to a sliding breech block that compensates for the additional width required for the mount and the need for a brass-cased charge to form a gas seal, or did someone high up in German ordnance procurement just own the patent to a sliding breech block design? One of the biggest misconceptions to dispel is not because the Germans wanted to use brass cartridges because they were safer to store some of the charges in. Bear in mind, even German battleship guns, they did have bagged charges. It's just they didn't make up the entire charge. The last charge or two had to be in a brass case in order to create the seal. So when people say, oh yes, well, German ammunition storage was far superior because they used the brass cartridge, which made it less vulnerable to flash fires, and they knew this, and this is why they did it. No. Yes, it was safer, because less exposed cartridges, but there are ways of making bagged cartridges also safe. Of course, if you obviate all those safety measures, they're no longer safe, but that's on you. But the Germans didn't select the brass cartridge specifically for any kind of safety purpose. They selected the brass cartridge for their ammunition because all of the German guns were made by Krupp, and Krupp had decided in the 1860s and 1870s that they were going to make guns with sliding breech blocks. And by the time the well-in breech block, which is the kind of screw-threaded one that everyone is mostly familiar with, was invented, well, one, it was invented by Vickers, and two, that whole thing came in around about the time that everyone was getting very nationalistic and very arms race-like, which meant that for Krupp, it was a choice of, well, we can keep doing what we're doing, we know what we're doing, and we can do it well, or we can pay large amounts of money to an English company for a license, and we then have to invest large amounts of money to completely retool how we make our guns. I don't think we're going to do that. And on they went, and then, thus passeth World War I, and by the time you get to the interwar period in World War II, well, Krupp has now been making sliding breech blocks guns for half a century. Again, if you're the Kriegsmarine now and you're trying to build the Bismarcks, are you going to pay several million more Reichsmarks to completely retool Krupp's gun manufacturing design and production areas? Or are you just going to accept that your guns still have sliding breech blocks? Well, you're going to do the latter, because Germany wasn't exactly swimming in Reichsmarks. Well, they were during the inflation crisis of the early 1930s, but they didn't really want to go back to that particular period. So it was basically a case of, if you are building a German warship, you're using a Krupp gun. Krupp makes sliding breech block guns. Like it or lump it. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And I will hope to see you again in another video. There is no immediate channel admin going on right at this moment. So, obviously, everyone fingers crossed for next month when hopefully the US will actually start to open up its travel restrictions. Because, as I said, I am not going to make any specific arrangements until that occurs for the US trip. But other than that, channel seems to be going on quite healthily, and I hope you're all enjoying it. Thank you very much.